right, we're here today with Dr. Charlie Greenwood, who was Juniper Gardens' second and I think longest tenured director. Thanks for being here, Charlie.
Oh, you're welcome.
First of all, could you describe for us the circumstances in which how you came to Juniper?
Sure. Let's see. So, I was a graduate student at the University of Utah, and in the late 60s and 1960s, and basically, I was increasingly intrigued by applied behavior analysis and psychology, and determined that was going to be my my field. And I was reading about, at that time, I was starting to read about studies from Vance Hall and the Juniper Gardens Children's Project as part of my coursework, and I got really excited about it. And so, long story short, after getting my PhD and being a special education teacher in Salt Lake City, Utah, I got a job, my first PhD job at the University of Oregon with a group of colleagues there, a fellow named Hill Walker. And Hill was a great friend of Vance Hall, and so I ran into Vance Hall and the Juniper Gardens people on a pretty regular basis during my five years at Oregon. And I was learning work. It was almost like a postdoc for me. I was learning how to use computers. I was learning how to write grant proposals. And at a certain point in that work, we didn't have any more grants left, so I was beginning to look for another job. And Vance Hall stepped up and invited me to apply for a job that was coming open here at Juniper Gardens. And so I arrived here in January of 1978, I hope that's right, at the Juniper Gardens Children's Project, and had my first day at the office in C.L. Davis's liquor store on 3rd and Richmond Street. So that's basically how I came to be here. I was thrilled and excited to be in the home of the other group of applied behavior analysis faculty, the Vance Hall, Todd Risley, the Mont Wolf, Don Baer, and I had the other honor, I think, in my career, I think, at Oregon, because the other group of behavior analysts were there, Jerry Patterson and Hill Walker. They were all beginning to discover how, at Oregon, how parents could change the behavior of their children in meaningful ways where they implemented the intervention, the parents did. And for me, that just became such a bellwether that there was a science of behavior and education that would allow the persons involved, the parents, the teachers, to actually make the changes that they were seeking to change and develop good outcomes. So it was pretty interesting in my career to have both backgrounds, because it contributed to a lot to where I am right now, I think, and what I know. The folks in Oregon were very good at randomized trials, and so I trained as a behavior analyst, and I knew single subject research design very well and had used it. And so the Oregon folks hired me because I knew that, and they wanted me to share that information. And I learned randomized trials from the work they were doing. So when I came to Juniper here, I had a pretty good background that helped me develop the work that I did here in the first few years.
So can you describe for us so you said you started when Juniper was in the basement of the liquor store. Can you describe what your impressions were like of that place and then of the people that you met when you got here?
Yeah. A little bit of excitement and a bit of being stunned and a little bit overwhelmed, because because it was, as I knew it would be. I mean, it was like going into a neighborhood environment in an African-American environment, and being in a place where I knew there was considerable danger, perhaps, and that, but on the other hand, that there were also really meaningful people doing great things, and so I just kind of had a thrill every day because I was learning about life in the northeast community of Kansas City, Kansas, and my early mentor in that was Uriel Owens, who was kind of co-director at that time. And the first grant that he tasked me to work on was, which is so reflective of the times, it was a grant to one of the agencies that dealt with the housing project, and it was a grant to enable the residents to teach them and empower them to be able to actually run the housing project. And the whole empowerment issue around people being in a housing project where everything was for their housing, everything was done for them. You know, the carpets were changed, the places were painted, upgrades all at once by somebody taking care of the facilities. But this was to develop the independence of poor people who met poverty guidelines and were living in the housing project and had no say over what happened with their home and, you know, the care of it and the upgrading of it. And so there were sections in the grant that dealt with updating the roofing, the lawn care, the community kinds of things. And, so it was something that I had never done before, but I was so excited about the fact that it was dealing with those kinds of issues. And of course it wasn't funded, but it taught me so much about what the spirit of Juniper was, and I've tried to carry that forward from there.
What was Uriel Owens like?
He was both stern and also very comical in many ways, and so you know, and he was so well known in the neighborhood and in the community. And he, when I first came here, he took me around in his large, big Cadillac and drove me all around the neighborhood. And the one time he took me to a store, and he double parked the car, and I'm sitting in the driver, or the shotgun seat, the passenger side. He goes into the store and says, "I'll be back in a minute." We're double parked. I'm sitting there, and this police officer pulls up in his cruiser and parks right next to us, and he gets out and comes over and he looks in at me, and he's an African American cop, and he looks at me and he says, "What are you doing in Uriel Owens' car?" Because he didn't know why I fit into the frame. And so nervously I just said, "Well, Uriel just went in, he said, be right back." And he says, "Okay." And he got back in his car and left. And so in a number of occasions like that, I knew that he was both well respected and a well-known player in the community at that time. He, because he had sickle cell disease, he had many times when we would be engaged in a project for day after day, and he would go to the hospital, and we wouldn't know. The next day we'd come back, he'd be in the hospital with having an episode there in the hospital, and he might not be back for a month or two, and then he'd come back with full of energy and be just going at it again, and the same thing would kind of happen. But increasingly he kind of drifted out of the project because his health became a concern or a limitation to him. But he also, he and his family, they established the local sickle cell anemia foundation, and Eric Kirkwood, who's still here and has been, I don't know if he's currently director of that program at this point, but that's been, been very good. in many times in the past, I would go with Eric out to the high schools and talk about sickle cell with the high school students. It's both as a way of helping them understand what it was and the differences between it's a genetic disease, and there's a difference between having the trait versus having the disease, and what that all means and how to handle it from there. So.
Could you describe some of your other early work in addition to that proposal that you put in with your?
Yeah. So at that point when I arrived, it was probably about a year and a half into a new grant cycle that Juniper had with the NICHD, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and in that project there was a school project with a school focus and a language project that was Hart and Risley's language project, and a behavioral medicine aspect that was directed by Edward Christofferson, and they were housed at the Med Center. So there was 3 coordinated projects, all dealing with how the environment, or how conditions in an environment affected children and families and health and educational outcomes. Long story short, they wanted me to help them develop a way of measuring the school environment. And up to that point in time, the behavior analysts and the people doing work here became very skilled at measuring behavior and the behaviors of individual children, and developing observation tools and methods of measurement that are much to their credit, that hadn't ever been developed before that I know of. But at Oregon, I'd been working on an ecological behavioral coding system, which allowed us to, we were trying to get to the point where we could have contemporaneous streams of information about what the environment was like when a child was making a particular response and when a teacher was making a particular response. And if we could do that within a small unit of time, know what the ecology was, the teacher behavior, the child behavior, and have that, in a record that's moving over time. So we have a stream of information on all 3 of those issues. We'd be able to look at each segment of that stream and study problem conditions in teaching, for example, or the environment, the larger environment, if you will, about when a child's got an inappropriate behavior, what are the surrounding ecological conditions when that's happening? And when they don't have that behavior problem, what are those conditions like? And could we find, from an analysis of these contrasting bits of information, could we find environmental features or teacher behaviors that either triggered or promoted or maintained a problem behavior? And could we contrast that to those behaviors when the child was doing well, and learn something about how the environment was related to the behavior of interest. This was a kind of a bigger development of what I thought, what became for me a kind of an analysis of the environmental problem conditions that surround a social problem, like low achievement, for example. And with the observation systems, we developed a scientific approach to capturing the environment, so we could actually study in detail some of its effects, and we could identify problem conditions like currently in our own work now, we're looking at, in preschools, we're looking at limited teacher focus on literacy, for example. If that doesn't happen very often, why would we expect children to learn literacy skills? And rather than just kind of asking the teacher about what their schedule is for the day around literacy and taking that as ground truth, the observational data actually gives us something you could think about being ground truth about how actually things evolve and transpire over time. So in a nutshell, what I brought was a coding system. We put it into an early computing system. I worked with some of the early computer programmers that began to show up at the Lifespan Institute in Lawrence, and we developed an approach in the first couple of papers that illustrated the findings. And that work has kind of been one of the scientific generators of many other eco-behavioral observation coding systems that have been at Juniper, including the classroom circle that we're using right now in preschool.
So Charlie, can you talk to us a little bit about what was the work environment like? And you came in the late 70s, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, you've probably seen some of the pictures. So the clothes, everybody wore, all the guys wore shirts with long collars, and it was very open and kind of low down on the chest. And anyway, what was the environment like? It was wonderful. The environment, the people that were involved, Vance, and when I came here, Vance was here. Vance who came, Joe Del Quadri. I don't know if I don't mean to not mention names, but Vance and his wife Marilyn at the time were just very open and cheerful, and they had events at their home, and they had everybody over, and so the graduate students at Lawrence, there was always a place to meet and talk and be involved in things. And soon after I came, though, Joe Del Quadri and I were setting up new facilities in the. We were asked to set up a new office in the basement of the Juniper Gardens Community Center, and it hadn't been used for maybe 10 years, and so we cleaned it out, opened it up, and we moved in a number of new people, so the project grew. We had Deborah Camps was a graduate student. She came in and was working with Joe Del Quadri on classified peer tutoring. Dale came, Judy came. We were funded for our first postdoctoral grant in 1983, and so Judy was one that came, and among many others over the years. Basically, we carried on the social life, I think, as we learned from Vance and Marilyn, and I think others that worked in the project, is that we were doing important work, and we also, of course, we learned from Muriel and the community people. We were doing important work. We respected the community. We hired people from the community as much as possible. My first group of observers for one of the codes I developed was was maybe 15 African American folks that we employed. It's just one example of many those events. We kind of had a spirit for the fact that we were working in a challenging environment, and we needed to make sure people were happy and reinforced and praised, and we tried to bring our positive reinforcement approach to our interventions to working with each other, and we were very serious about it, because we knew that now we've learned that people will not be working in a challenging environment. It takes unique people to be involved and to work regularly and love to work in a submarine or in a community where there's violence and challenges and other things, and so particularly when they're not paid very much, and their work is really from the heart around what they're trying to do to improve outcomes for children and build a better nurturing environment for people. And so we tried to keep it, we tried to apply what we were trying to do, inventing, to ourselves, and we had many people that enjoyed that. And you hear, I think, many people leave here and will say that what a great place it was to work, because we were doing better at that kind of recognition of the colleagues and appreciating the colleagues, their contributions, than most other places, particularly in academia. But very important, and yeah.
What do you think were some of the most important events that occurred from when you started at Juniper Gardens until you became director?
Let's see. Well, that's that area. Well, see, in that period, my own work was on classified peer tutoring, and with Joe Del Quadri, and we went from the first study of peer tutoring was carried out by Joe Del Quadri. And interesting fact is that I had known Joe at Oregon, because he and I worked together at Oregon. He was a school psychologist, and I was a project director at that time there. And then as the way things go, both he and I came out to Juniper Gardens. He to finish his PhD, and I came out to be, a researcher at about the same time. But in Joe's dissertation, he found out that his findings were that if he tutored kids that were not making progress in the classroom and who were the teachers were really concerned about in terms of their reading, and he was focused on reading, if he tutored them outside the classroom just by having them read passages repeatedly, and he would provide them feedback and correction and some reinforcement, that they vastly improved their oral reading rates, their correct reading rates. And he was inventing measurement of oral reading out of a reading text as a measurement strategy. And he'd show that compared to baseline, that their correct oral reading rates would just shoot up with repeated practice. So when I got here and I was on his dissertation committee, we started to think about, well, how could we take those principles and apply them in a classroom class-wide? And the principles were things about pretty much where they were devoted to measuring progress of individual kids. And so we invented a Friday test. We did a simple Friday test over the passages and that the kids were reading. And the other principle was repeated practice. And so we just decided we would pair the kids up. And we would break them into teams, and we'd have competing teams to see who won a point total for their tutoring of each other. And part of the repeated practice that we put together was that that one child would read to the other for the tutor for 5 minutes, and they'd trade roles for another 5 minutes, and then they would check points and add their points for the team. But what that is an example of is this crafting of the details of instruction around how the interactions were going to occur, and showing and measuring that they were actually effective. And so that's basically Joe reached out to Kathleen Stretton, who was a 4th grade teacher, I think at Grant Elementary School, and we did a first study there with her doing the class-wide peer tutoring. And we further developed from that, and eventually we did a randomized trial through about 7 elementary schools in the KCK district, and got very good results and got a first publication about it. And then because we had the continuing grant, we followed them up in middle school and then in high school, and also got some major results. And that work, that sequence of work is published in the What Works Clearinghouse in terms of the Institute for Educational Practices as a certified promising practice. Very proud of that. But that was kind of the key at that time. There were some other developments. Linda Thurston and Linda was working on women's issues in the community, and we got a grant from the human HHS to develop a survival skills intervention program in the community for women, and we called them survival skills. And it was a curriculum, and that curriculum was also later widely distributed around the United States and involved in many programs. And so that was another area that began basically, and as our postdocs started to get moving along, Judy wrote a grant to do an early childhood eco-behavioral measurement proposal, and that grant was funded, and that started her program of work that's continued through to today. So,
can you just talk a little bit about that early funding storm under Reagan that Juniper Gardens went through?
Yeah, that was a good one. So that was I think in the 90s, at some point in the 90s, and if you will check the calendar. But the Reagan administration came in, and I think they had as memory serves, their Secretary of Education was somebody, I think his name was James Watts. And anyway, Reagan was he came in office intending to get rid of the U.S. Department of Education. And so in the first year that they were there, all the grants that we had sent into at that time, we were now applying for grants from the new Office of Special Education Programs that had a very robust funding program in place, and Judy had received a grant, and we were continuing to expand that with our grant submissions. But anyway, one day we got all the proposals came back to us that we'd sent in with a message. There was no internet then, really, so we just got everything back in the mail. Just said, we're returning these to you because we've canceled all the competitions this year, and we'll likely not have any anymore. So that was a big challenge. And so as politics plays out, it was increasingly difficult for them to, and it maybe repeats itself, it was increasingly difficult for them to change the Department of Education. And I won't try to sketch the history, but 2 years later, the competitions returned, maybe 1 year later.
How did Juniper Gardens survive that storm?
We've always survived storms because of the Lifespan Institute or the Bureau of Child Research. At various times, they've come forward with support for the various staff members and the directors of the Lifespan, Schiefelbusch, Warren, and Schroeder and Warren and Colombo have all committed they all end up committing resources to keep the program running. And by that time, Juniper was kind of growing from being just a one project shop, which was funded by the NICHD, to now having multiple projects, and several investigators several researchers were coming right up from our shop, and so Deb Camps was getting grants from the Office of Special Ed. Judy Carter was getting them. Some of our other postdocs began getting them. I was continuing to get funding, and so we were growing, but we did have some bridging funds when that happened, and for us, and that was, for us, that was kind of as a critical an event as you could imagine, because we hadn't ever seen that before. Of course, we weren't all that experienced, but we hadn't seen it before because you have to realize that in the 60s, and in the administrations of the 60s, that there was so much funding to support African American communities, and Head Start was starting, and people were realizing they had to invest in young children in poverty and the anti-poverty program. And so I think I was fortunate, and many of us were fortunate, to emerge into this business at a time when the resources were quite rich and continuing to expand. And then this, in the 90s, was kind of the first point where there was a contraction of the type. Before that, however, we had gone through 2 years where, after having 5 funding cycles through NIH, they decided they weren't going to be dealing with poverty anymore. And so, unfortunate for me, I had proposals that were not funded, and Juniper, the NICH project itself, stopped. So if you think of interruption of funding, that was one that was pretty critical. And we then tried, scrambling I was exploring what I knew from Oregon, which is we'd been funded from the special ed programs there for all the work I did at Oregon. And that hadn't been tapped at Juniper yet by then. So that work began filling the void and around the changing over from NIH funding to Department of Education funding. And the most recent transition of that was in the 2000s, when the research mission of the Office of Special Ed was transferred to the new IES funding center that was created. And myself and others worked really hard to begin to learn and be involved in that transition. Luckily, we knew one of the new director from my Oregon experience, the new director of the special ed program in IES. And so I just said, if there's anything we can do to help you figure out what to do with it in this new role, we're here to help. So if you want input on anything, and so we, at various times, very appropriately, we were invited to go to planning meetings in DC with other people and help them work on how they would create a funding profile of topics that would be important to them. And that relationship kind of continued for a while. And by that time, Jay Bazard was here now after a postdoc, and Murray Appett was here after a postdoc. This was at the IES transition. And we began submitting proposals based on class-wide peer tutoring to the IES. But anyway, it was a paradigm change in special ed at that time. At that time, the School of Education trained professionals in research were not highly regarded at this time, and politically, and so we were finding that the program managers and peer and reviewers were very often sociologists or anthropologists or other social behavioral sciences, psychology, that didn't necessarily share an educational, they were theoretically really good at research around randomized trials. But anyway, the challenge was for us is how to fit into this dramatic transition, and we did, and we found ways. We found very good avenues of work, because they created a funding profile around measurement and descriptive, where the goal 1 was about descriptive exploratory correlational research. intervention research, scaling up research, and effectiveness studies. And as they got better at doing their work, we got better at responding to their research priorities.
If we back up a little
Yeah.
bit from there, could you describe the transition from, it's totally,
So, yeah,
no, it's
people
good because that
edit-
answers a
edit that
future
part out.
question.
No,
But, no, you're doing great.
Yeah.
No, that takes care of
Very
that part
different.
that we would get to a little bit later on. If you could describe the transition from having Vance as director to you being director,
Right.
how
Okay.
did that happen?
How did that happen?
yeah, so maybe when it happened and some, what changed, how you felt about it.
Well, let's see, how did it happen? I guess I'd been here probably about 10 years. But, at some point, given what I'd been asked to do with to establish this research program around the environment, it had grown, it was expanding to we had new investigators and we were growing. And at some point, I think Vance when he decided he'd retire, he didn't tell me he was retiring, but he said he was going to take a sabbatical.
We heard that.
Yeah, and so did I. So he did, and so he basically says, "Well, I'm gone. You're in charge." And so I tried to act like it, even though it was mostly just continuing to do the necessary support for everyone who's working in the program, to try to keep them nurtured and on task, doing good work, finding opportunities, overcoming the challenges, and we were growing, and so I found it was increasingly important to. One of the things I did was established a monthly meeting of the PIs. We'd never had that before, and we had to have a meeting to now basically have a business meeting around our different grants, and particularly the budget. And Betty Smith, who had been our financial director ever since I'd been there, now had multiple grant budgets to track and to handle and take care of. And so we also, part of the nurturing and keeping things on track was I developed a 6-month ahead forecasting tool, so that in our monthly meetings we would always look at where are we right now. In 6 months, what will the situation look like? So we were like doing a future forward what if kind of thing, thinking about, well, in 6 months, Charlie's this grant, this and that grant is going to end, and so those people need to be working on a proposal, and what are they working on? And we kind of use that 6 months ahead way of kind of managing our work, in fall and spring semesters, and with the effort of keeping everyone funded, and trying to, it was in this business. It's easy to learn that you have to keep a rate of proposal submission going if you're going to continue to support your individual program of research. And I was working with all the investigators to keep them thinking about their individual program of research, what it was they did, and how it contributed to Juniper, and how did it relate to each other, and how could we collaborate with each other to make everybody's work progress. So those were a couple of things. We also instituted a system of recognition among the staff, so that that every month we would have, people could put in a tray, they would put a commendation in there about somebody who did a really great job for them on the staff. And we you know, in some of our potlucks and celebrations, we'd celebrate somebody who'd gotten a lot of commendations, and so keep the spirit up, keep the eye on the prize, and move forward.
How did you find out that Vance wasn't coming back as director?
I guess I kind of got the idea because it was getting to be a long time, so I didn't ever know with